we ran this microfunding program called the Community Kickstart Fund, where we were offering small amounts of funding, just up to £2,000 of direct payments for goods and services to groups of older people who wanted to start their own social activities. I mean, I'm not saying that every single group we funded was a kind of grassroots, unconstituted group of older people, but that's who we were really aiming at. And the decisions on what got funded were made by a wonderful group of older people, including Jane and Judith, who are here today. And so I provided some basic training, but that was very much kind of very collaborative training in how to assess those applications. But the panel also influenced the application form as the years went on, as the microfunding project went on and the pot reserves went down. We were always trying to make that make it more accessible to those kinds of grassroots groups of older people. So the panel were also very instrumental in helping us to change the application form to make it more accessible, do outreach work to try and reach those groups, and just make it make it as accessible as possible to those groups as well. So hopefully we'll have some insight both on the experience of the panel and for us working with the panel and being able to, and how much they helped us to be able to give our money to projects that were really benefited older people from the perspective of isolation and loneliness, but were also really sustainable long term, but also how the co-commissioning in terms of really working with groups to help them to apply for funding rather than getting people to navigate a really difficult process, how that benefited us as well.
Thank you, Bianca. And so I'm going to just hand over now to Jane and then to Judith, who both sat on the co-commissioning panel over in Bristol. So Jane, if you just want to just tell us a little bit about your experience of that.
Mute myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thanks.
I think Judith will have more to say than I do, because I started as a volunteer in 2016. So when I retired from full-time work, I started as a BAB volunteer, mainly sat on the panel that commissioned the Kickstart community projects. But also, I think it's important to say that Bristol Ageing Better involved their volunteers in other ways as well. So we were also invited to sit on interviewing panels when it came to selecting the BAB management team. And so I think we felt that we were very much involved in the whole organisation, even though my main role was to sit on the Kickstart panel, and that was the main part of my role. We also felt that we were included in other ways and that we had a say in the whole organisation. And I think that the support that Bianca gave us enabled us all to feel confident in fulfilling that role. And I think that support is really, really important. I hadn't ever done any volunteering like this before, but I would now feel confident about volunteering with other different organisations because of my experience. Judith had done a lot more than me, and she'd had a lot more experience. I think as volunteers we shared our experience as well, and we supported one another, and we felt that we were a very supportive group amongst ourselves. So for me, it was a very rewarding experience, and I was sorry that it was only for a fixed term, because I would have loved to have carried on doing it.
Thanks so much, Jane, and I think you've really picked up on the the principle of reciprocal relationships, which is part of the co-production journey, of course, and that's really great to hear. So over to you, Judith, if you want to just add your thoughts.
Well, for me, co-production was BAB in Action was co-production, because as Jane and Bianca said right from the very beginning, volunteers were involved. They helped us to choose the team from the very beginning. They helped us to develop. We had a steering group of older people. So I feel very happy about the way it worked in Bristol. And I think the word I would use is supportive. I think the professionals learned a lot about what people in the community wanted. And I think that we learned an awful lot from the professionals. And we respected, both sides respected each other, which is the most important thing, I think. And above all, we were willing to learn and develop on both sides of the equation. And we learned and developed together. And that's really about all I can add to what the other two told you.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Judith. So over to you, Emil, bringing a different perspective in outside of Aging Better.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited about this because I'm looking at co-production with two hats on, in a way, as a commissioner, where we, of course, need to look at co-production when we design our services before we procure those. And then as a sort of reviewing bids and contracts in terms of submissions and how co-production features in submissions that we then review and score. So for us, it's an interesting time because as a city council over the last 3-4 years, we've been going through a huge transformation from the sort of care management model to a strengths and asset-based model. And within that, we always highlight that assets are community organizations, our communities, but also citizens and individuals. So we're trying to take pride in how we look at co-production. And I think it's really, although I'm going to say a double negative, but it is a positive for us when we look at this early on. And we could say that co-production for us could be expensive and could be time consuming. But if we start with that in mind and we build that into our commissioning cycle, we're then well ahead of everybody else who wouldn't consider those things and therefore haven't got the resources or the budget to do it properly, because I think there is a difference, as we all know, doing it and doing it properly. And for us, it's about the whole commissioning cycle. So it's not just certain aspects of it, but the entire cycle. And this is where challenges lie ahead of us, because we often get it right in certain aspects of the commissioning cycle, but we don't in some of the others. And that's something that we're still on a journey to perfect, I guess. But as a prevention and communities commissioning team, we've been really focused on ensuring that all of our services, as well as our own team, doesn't follow the tick box exercise type of co-production approach. And we've got some really amazing examples of co-production, and I'm so pleased that you've got a separate session on neighbourhood network schemes coming up, and we've got a whole green neighbourhood network scheme here, actually, representatives in the meeting, which is great. So you will hear a lot about NNS and how co-production is looked at in that project. But we've also run a huge grants program in Birmingham about 2 years ago. And we really started to think about how can we approach co-production innovatively and how can we build into the whole cycle the sort of resources and the time and the money to be able to do it properly. And having done that, we were able to actually create citizen panels in front of which all potential bidders who have gone through initial sift had to present in front of citizen panels. And the points scored by these citizen panels were equally took into consideration, as well as officer panels, before these scores were presented to seniors and local members. And that was something we haven't done before, because we often have a citizen or a couple of citizens involved in the procurement activity, but we don't actually involve citizens in decision making as well as the sort of analysing or planning stage. So that was really good for us. But I think we still have some time to go in terms of making sure that issue around staffing and budgets in commissioning, where we are really struggling for money and resources, and co-production goes really head to head, and we need to think about the whole commissioning cycle as early as we can. And then, of course, we've got the other aspects, which is when we review bids coming in and we look at co-production, which for us in our team is huge. There is a lot that we don't understand from the sector's point of view in terms of how difficult or not, how time consuming and how expensive that might be for the sector to do it properly as well. And how can we recognize as commissioners that actually if something isn't yet known or isn't yet co-developed, but it is in plans to do so, that we also take that into consideration, and that sometimes you have to test things out, and we don't always have answers, which we are very risk averse to as local authorities. However, we're trying to take more risks, especially in grant funded activities, and that's something we need to recognize a bit more. And it would be great to hear from partners here about that.
Fantastic, thank you. That's so refreshing to hear, you know, moving away from the whole tick box exercise around bringing people into the decision-making processes, and really opening up and being realistic about what's involved actually, right from the very, very beginning. Thank you. So Anna, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, my name's Anna Gohan, and I guess my background really is predominantly health and social care commissioning. And I was one of those directors in the early days in 2003, 2004, where we were trying then to bring integrated services together and commissioning together across a local authority and what was then the primary care trusts. So I guess I come at this from a range of perspectives, one being a former carer of somebody with dementia in my family and knowing how difficult it was to navigate that. Two, being a former commissioner and a joint commissioner across a local authority and primary care trust. And more laterally, since 2011-12, I was the founding director and chief exec of two social enterprise organisations, the Life Story Network, which is very much premised on knowing somebody's life history and life story and building that assets around them and ensuring that they have a life and a quality of life rather than a service. And then in 2015, following yet another initiative from the Department of Health and NHS around a carer's call to action, specifically for carers around people with dementia, after the success of that year of action, they decided that they weren't going to continue anything. And we thought, well, why not? Because this is a fabulous example of where carers were supported to have a voice and to become involved in policy research, commissioning and practice. So as a small social enterprise organisation in Liverpool, actually we were based in Liverpool, we took on the Carers Call to Action and worked with carers to co-design exactly what that new model should look like. So carers were central to that. And we launched Tide, which was, and they named it Tide and did all the branding. We launched Tide as a program of work within the Life Story Network community interest company in 2015. And that became a charity in 2019 after enabling us to get investment of over 2.8 million for the Life Story Network and Tide, and it's a UK-wide network. And I think for me, the principles that we've talked about and that I've heard over the last 3 weeks around asset-based approaches, co-production, how do we actually put that lived experience at the center of what we're trying to achieve, and also how critically, and this is the big question for me, how do we move from the fringes of where co-production is currently happening in wonderful ways, in wonderful projects, but how do we actually make it mainstream now that we've got the opportunity, supposedly, through the new integrated care systems? And I guess there's a little bit of a big question for me, because we have got loads of models. Thank you, Vicky, to you and your team for another fabulous model around co-production that is available nationally. we had a report by the New Economics Foundation back in 2016, which actually, and I'll put these links in the chat, but which actually paints a really effective model. And very much, Emil, it will resonate with you in terms of what you said about actually having, rather than the select few or the tokenistic approach to having a few people involved, how do you really embed it in all cycles of that commissioning cycle? And what the report does is change the focus of commissioning into focusing around prevention, well-being, and real value for money, but then critically look at how we develop insights into what's there already, the assets, how we involve everybody in the planning, delivery, and then the reflection in terms of learning from that and moving forward. So I've been really curious, I guess, about how we can really use this opportunity through ICSs to really mainstream that, if there's a coalition of the willing at a national, regional, and local level.
Wow. There's a lot there, isn't there? It's a really big question, and I guess the opening sort of question is, how do we do that? How do we also show that it's possible to work in this way, and how do we showcase, I suppose, the experience that we all have to be able to demonstrate that, and what does that actually look like when we're starting to integrate that into the whole cycle, as it were. So it'd be interesting to kind of open that up to thoughts around that. And I've just noticed, thank you so much, Anna, for that. I've just noticed that Deb's has got her hand up, so just invite you into the conversation if you've got an actual question for her.
Yeah, for me it was really interesting to hear when you spoke, Jane, you were talking about it in the past, and I was thinking, why are we talking about in the past? And then I understood that perhaps the money for the grant thing had ended. But what was really interesting when you were talking, you were saying actually you felt you were part of the organisation, and so it wasn't just the grant thing that you were, it was you were embedded. So that for me, I suppose, is kind of to come back around to Anna's question, kind of it's not just the technical project specific things that we do, is it? It's about actually valuing the range of people in that decision process, but as a core part of that organisation, not as a thing that ends and disappears. So I suppose, yeah, I was interested to kind of learn from the BABS project about, even though you did have that embedded thing, why did that not continue even though the other things ended? Be just interesting to reflect on that.
I've just done the classic then and muted myself. Thank you very much, Des, for opening up that conversation. So yeah, Bianca, do you want to come in on that?
Sure. I mean, the simple answer in terms of commissioning is that we are no longer commissioning projects at Bristol Aging Better. So the programme was actually meant to finish in 2019, but we have, 2020. But we've been fortunate enough to have a couple of extensions from the lottery, sort of small amounts of money to run the programme for a couple more years. But that's really been about embedding the learning and the evaluation from the 5-year programme. So we haven't had a kind of budget of money to spend. So we unfortunately have not had a microfunding scheme, a pot of money to give out through microfunding since 2019. So we haven't been able to have those commissioning panels, which is a shame. And we are very much hoping, as I say, we're really trying to get that evidence out there about what's really worked, and particularly I think with the Community Kickstart Fund, it was a very small amount of the BAD budget. It was just £250,000 of a 5.9 million programme. but it was one of the really effective ways in which we spent our money demonstrably, because so many of the small activities that we funded went on to be sustainable beyond that point, many of them self-sustainable, either because they were volunteer-led or they, you know, we call it Kickstart, we just gave them a small amount of money to be able to like carry on an activity that essentially paid for itself or could be done free of charge. So it's been really effective in that way, and the transparency of the process and the co-commissioning element were the kind of two things that really made that happen. So we are still really hoping. There is money in Bristol. There are quite a lot of quite wealthy charities. We are still hoping that another organisation might be able to pick that up. One of the only things is that, as Jane sort of kindly said, it does take a fair bit of administration from that third sector organisation to be able to do that kind of microfunding. So quite a lot of admin time for me in actually buying those goods and services to start the activities. So it's about finding an organisation that could sort of take on the administration as well. But very much hoping that Kickstart might come back, that we might have some kind of similar microfunding scheme in Bristol again, in which case it would be amazing if the panel could get involved again. But I mean, I miss Jane and Judith. It would be great to find other ways in which we can work together, in that we now know that we've got until next March. We've got just over another year of the programme. But yeah, unfortunately, no more decisions to be made on actual kind of funding and delivery at the moment.
The ideas, however, have started permeating out into Bristol. We know the City Council has been interested in that idea, and we've still got feelers out there. We know also that Monica Wills, which is a massive amount of money of the great and the good all lobbed together in Bristol, we know that they're interested in it and they're thinking about things like that. So it isn't lost to Bristol. A lot of the good work that was done will carry on. And also we're now involved, we've got a seat at the table in the One City office, which is set up by Bristol City Council, which carries on regardless of who the mayor is into the future, we hope. So it's not lost, and the good that it's done is still there. And I think the thing that we're proudest of is that we've proved that these organisations can be sustainable by themselves, because once the money ran out, so many of them have continued off their own backs.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you for adding to that, Judith, and just sort of explaining what the potential plans are for the future. But also, yeah, part of the whole application process was around sustainability, wasn't it? When you were putting out applications, and I believe that activities projects, you know, had to come up with their own sustainability model, because it was the idea about enabling and then being able to kind of carry that forward. But I suppose it's how we integrate it on a wider level is one of the key things to consider. I'm just conscious that Barbara's got a question or comment to make, but did you want to come in on that, Anna, before we kind of move on?
Yes, I suppose just to give you a very brief example. So again, you know, my question is, how can we integrate it and mainstream it in the governance of organisations? So just a brief example from our experience in Greater Manchester, which has a devolved authority for a number of years now. And again, it took us as Tide, the Together in Dementia Everyday organisation or charity, about 2.5 years to get a seat, not just at the table, because we had 1 or 2 people involved, but I was very clear that what we wanted was a sustainable model of continual involvement in dementia, in the design, the commissioning, and also the review and the feedback, and that it was premised on people's lives, not services. And so when I was asked to have 1 or 2 carers sit at the operational team and the strategic board, I resolutely refused, if I'm being honest, for about 18 months, until they funded an expert panel that we then had carers from both the Chinese community, South Asian community, the Irish community, and we also had representatives across the 10 authorities in Greater Manchester. And there was a representative then of that group, the chair of the group, sat on the operational board of Dementia United, which was the programme board, but also she sat alongside me on the strategic programme board at a regional level. And I think what we've learned from that are a number of things. It is about power. So it is about really trying to get commissioners and providers to relinquish some power and not be afraid, because one of the fear factors is that if you ask the question about what people want, they may actually ask for something that is unable to be delivered. And if that wasn't the case, people are very honest, people are very sensible, and people have got realistic expectations, especially when you go through what the resource constraints are. But what people are very, very creative, and they're also very innovative in terms of thinking of other ways of doing things. So for me, the success of that small piece of work is that now that Tide is no longer directly involved with them, they have got funding from the commissioners as a core part of the governance going forward. And that model will now be taken into the integrated care system governance in Greater Manchester, which I think that's, for me, where we want to strive to get, in terms of rather than having it grant funded, because these programs usually last 3 to 5 years or whatever, but actually how do we embed it in the governance process of commissioning here and now?
Yeah, really valuable thinking there, Anna, thank you. Barbara, you've got either a question or maybe a comment that you want to make about what you've heard?
Yes, in part, some of it's been answered by the discussion. I suppose my comment was that the microfunding project that Bristol has described and has been done in other places, and as has already been said, is often very stop-start. But if cumulatively we're building the evidence that this is a really good way of doing business, my question is, how can we use that cumulative evidence to start to influence, you know, the ways in which funding is delivered, whether it's via things like community foundations or whether it's, you know, wherever it comes from, but that actually microfunding is seen as part of the mix. If we've got enough evidence to show how well it works and how effective it is, you know, rather than constantly just waiting for the next short-term funding opportunity to appear, really. And it seems to me, because I think this program that you've put on, and I've only been able to come to some of it, has been fantastic. And it seems to me that you've got quite a lot of clout in this program, the collective work that you've all done, to maybe push some of that thinking forward.
Thank you, Barbara.
And then if I may, I have another question for Emil, which around the sort of commissioning cycle process, just because the citizen panels you described, it is something that we've done and I'm familiar with, but we are there to, in a way, comment on the tenders that have been put in and how the different organisations have responded to that. To what extent have you been able to get people's citizens' voice, if you like, into deciding what is commissioned? Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. I don't know whether Maria, because Maria was first, so I wonder whether Maria wants to ask a question, or should I?
Carry on, Emil.
Okay. Right, let me just get my hand down. Yeah, so there were actually 2 points. One point was around what you've just been talking about, which is that how do you embed what we're doing into long-term sustainable approach that's in governance, and it's built into also local authority priorities moving forward. And it's really interesting to hear that, because in Birmingham we're kind of that one step further with this, because we have by taking on the transformation program of strength and asset-based approach and changing our social work model to the 3 conversations model, which is all about community intervention. It's all about connecting to family, friends, and networks. We were able to, with the support of seniors, and that's so important in terms of buy-in and support from the top. We've been able to completely transform the way we commission in Birmingham, and as a result, we've been able to work with our seniors to understand the long-term approach into community development versus pouring money into deficits and trying to get results within 12 months, which is just never going to happen in the line of work that we do. For them to actually invest in something such as the neighbourhood network schemes in Birmingham, which are really an infrastructure support for all the adults, whereby we grant on place-based basis to community assets from micros to large organizations based on localized demand, priorities, and feedback from citizens and professionals. And by doing that pilot scheme, we're now actually at the point of recommissioning this 2 years later. And there is full support and full buy-in from across all of the adult social care directors within the City Council, including cabinet member, including stakeholders. And we've engaged over 500 stakeholders in conversations about the redesign of this. And all of the stakeholders agreed that it should be extended, expanded potentially to younger adults, and so on and so on and so on. So it's about taking risks. And I think if you've got evidence, like Anna said, if you've got the buy-in, if you are sat around the table and you can take risks, it really can pay off. And that support just keeps building and that buy-in comes with it. And I think we are on that journey in Birmingham where we, despite savings, further savings and further savings, we're still able to invest in prevention and in community assets in that way. And it's not just about money, like somebody mentioned. We do a lot of capacity building that doesn't include money. And that's a huge part of it, because there are so many micros that actually don't need money. They want to be part of a network. They want to be part of conversations. They want tea for a year, and that's all they might want to be able to sustain, yet the impact that they deliver is huge. So if anybody ever wants to have a conversation or a little bit more information about neighbourhood network schemes, which we have kind of pinched from Leeds with approval, of course, and changed it and made it fit Birmingham, or even if you want to speak to one of the NNSs, and we've got at least one person here from one of those neighbourhood network schemes in Birmingham, please feel free to let us know. To answer Barbara's point, I think there are 2 different things that we're looking at in the council, and our team is probably the biggest team and the only team really in commissioning that does so many grants. And this is something that I think local authorities have moved away from, because grant funding doesn't have that legal standing the same way as contracts. It's about risk taking, and local authorities don't like doing that often, especially at the moment. Whereas we've gone the other way, because without grants, we can't really engage micros. It's pretty much impossible to do that on larger contracts. So when we're looking at grants, we've got full flexibility of how we do that. We design the process completely, and we run with the process the way we want to run with it. So in terms of grants, we're able to involve citizens right from the start to the end, and including decision making. And these panels were incredible, because we had probably about 100 bids to get through officer panels and citizens panels, and we actually spent a lot of time training citizens, make sure they understand what the program is about, them feeding into the program design, and then the decision making. And we having to think about how do we involve citizens in the evaluation part and the learning that Anna mentioned, which we're not doing very well on our front in terms of that co-production part and the whole commissioning cycle. That last part we're not really great at the moment as yet. In terms of commissioned and tendered opportunities, it becomes a little bit more complicated, because there are so many legalities behind procurement and rules and regulations. But we still follow the same kind of pathway from the start, when we're either reviewing an existing service or thinking about commissioning a new type of service. So as a team, we'll still do all of the pre-work around planning and analyzing and involving stakeholders in that engagement and co-production part of it. When it comes to the tenders and the evaluations, it becomes a little bit more problematic because we often have 1 or 2 citizens that are involved in evaluating bids. What we try to do is, because we often find, and NNSs will also confirm that if you have, and you will know yourselves, if you have 1 or 2 citizens and 10 professionals, often the citizen doesn't have that confidence to challenge or express their views. So we either have or express a willingness to have more citizens involved, and procurement can be quite flexible in terms of light touch regime and the changes in the environment, or we work with our internal citizen engagement team to engage with citizens who have that previous experience and are confident and challenging in that space, so that they can actually really challenge us. And we've done that before when we've worked with a citizen who was so challenging and so confident that it was just incredible how many decisions were made because of that citizens in that evaluation meeting. But it's difficult because if you don't do that pre-work and if you don't have that, like we have the citizen engagement team, if you haven't got that team who's got a database of tens of citizens who can work and develop and train the citizen that might want to be involved in that specific procurement part of NNS, they have to be prepared. They have to understand what the service is about in order to evaluate bids. They have to have the confidence and be challenging. If you don't do that pre-work, it will be a tick box exercise, and it happens all the time, especially in the commissioning world. And that's partially, it's not often because we don't want to do it. It's often because we do jobs for 2 or 3 people because of the cuts, and we have such budgets that often we have a budget for the specific activity and nothing else around it. So if we think about booking rooms, if we think about training, if we think about even lunches for citizens who might be with you for 8 hours assessing bids, which we've done before in the panels, of course, switching people around, not providing lunch for somebody who's giving up their time to do such great work, it's not something that we would be prepared to do. So you have to build all of that within the budgets as well, which often is quite challenging.
Thank you, Emil, and also thank you, Anna, for sharing the information in there and sort of, underlining the fact that the issue is about power sharing and recognising the value of lived experience. And then obviously you've talked about enabling and helping people to build confidence to be able to engage and to challenge going forward. I know there's a few hands up in the room, and before I move over to Maria, and then I know Val wanted to come in and say something as well. You talked about getting buy-in at senior level and how important that is. So I'd just be interested to know how you went about, getting that buy-in in the first place, really.
I think it was a mixture of things. The whole decision of moving away from care management model to a strength and asset-based model within the council was the first step, and all of that really came after the Care Act was implemented. And there was a handful of people who were very passionate about communities, very passionate about doing the social work that social work is trained for, rather than doing things to people, having met them for 2 hours and writing a 30-page assessment and pouring money into care for people who perhaps don't need it long term. And there was a handful of people who went out there and actually traveled across the country and went to Leeds, talked to NNS, went elsewhere and talked to others, brought some of that information back. And it so happened that we at that time had a new director of adult social care, Professor Graham Betts, and his experience and past work skills were just perfect for this type of work. And he was so passionate about working with communities yet again, like we used to do 20 years ago. So, and investing back in VCSC sector, working and getting that relationship and trust, but also hearing social workers. We've never gone and asked social workers for their opinion about any community kind of opportunities, and yet they are the ones that see thousands of citizens every day and get that raw intelligence. And we've never really done that. So we flipped everything on its head and implemented the 3 conversations model. And then when we implemented that model, and actually data showed that around about 70% of customer inquiries coming into social services are resolved at conversation 1. And conversation 1 is all about community, family, neighborhood connections. We then had to sit down and talk to seniors and say, well, actually, what are we going to do if 70% of your inquiries are due to be signposted, or what we say introduced, because we prefer to introduce citizens now to community offer rather than signpost, because it might not work out and they're back on our books. How are we going to cope with that demand where we're not investing in community assets? So it just didn't make sense, because we knew that there would be a backlash of no capacity within the market. So these conversations started to go around the senior leadership, and that's how we've been able to show some evidence from elsewhere, such as Leeds and NS, some of the data, some of the long-term approach to community development, and actually enable leaders to understand community development, because quite often they don't have that detailed knowledge because they're too senior, and they don't have the time. You know, when you go to present to them, you've got 20 minutes, you've got 30 minutes. So we started asking for more time, we started to show more data, we started to show more innovative opportunities. And then, of course, everything happened at the same time. The 3 conversations model was introduced. Graham Betts was with us as our adult social care director. We started these conversations about how are we going to implement the new social work model without investment in the community. And all of that came kind of together, and seniors decided that they would start with all the adults in terms of implementing the community development strategy again back in place. And now, 2.5 years later, it's been so successful that not only that we're looking at recommissioning for 5 to 7 years, but we're also looking at potentially including younger adults with long-term disabilities, which we're just trying to find some money for, which is always a difficulty. But actually data 2-3 years later had shown that adult social care had reduced, had produced savings of around 30 to 40%, which for such local authority as us, that's millions, that's literally millions. And then you've got on the other side, reduced staff sickness, reduced staff complaints, reduced citizen complaints, increased local community asset engagement, trust, so many positives, not just money, of course, but that's difficult because we have so many savings. And as the directorate, we've hit all of our saving targets. And this is where all these different community activities came together, and we are not distinguishing how much NNS saved, how much 3 conversations saved, how much family group conferencing saved. We're looking at it as a whole system, and now we're thinking about how do we do that on a whole life course approach. So thinking about transitions, thinking about not focusing on certain aspects such as somebody's client group or age, etc. So there's still a lot of work to do, don't get me wrong. There's still embedding, there's still sustainability. We are a huge local authority, so there's still a lot of learning to do, but we are on a really good journey.
Brilliant, doing some fantastic stuff. Barbara's asking if your conversation model's written up, so you might want to just answer that in the chat. I don't know if you can maybe direct people to any information around that. I'm going to go over to Maria, because I know Maria's been waiting very patiently to come into the conversation. So thank you, Emil, that's brilliant.
I'm laughing because you asked my question.
After all that.
And Emil's answered it. I would just add that as well as I have to sort of blow our own trumpets here, I think the work that Ageing Better in Birmingham has done and the evidence that's provided and the model that has demonstrated has also had a big influence on the creation of the neighbourhood network schemes in Birmingham. So, and we're working alongside each other now. As some of the neighbourhood network schemes in Birmingham will tell you, I'm trying to go to all their meetings and put my face in there so that we can talk about the needs of the LGBT community in Birmingham. But it has felt really, really positive, and I think Emil's answer is absolutely amazing. I can't wait for this recording to come out so that I can watch it again and take notes this time.
Take it all in. Yeah, there's so much information in there, isn't there? Definitely. Anna, sorry, and then I'll come to Val.
No, I think just to reflect back in terms of how can we use the evidence, because I think that the issue for me is not the lack of evidence. There's an overwhelming library of evidence to focus around the value of lived experience. Obviously, asset-based community approaches. We've got books upon books of that. We've got guidance on guidance of that. I think there's something about actually getting what I would describe as a coalition of the willing. And I guess I'm looking to national organisations like Ageing Better, like Think Local Act Personal, like National Voices, like Health Watch, because they have been working in a way that co-production and ACBD approaches have been central to their lives for some time. I think we have got a window, and I mean a very slight window of opportunity, because at the moment, the new integrated care systems have no statutory powers whatsoever. They're mandated from, again, unfortunately, a top-down reorganisation. They call themselves integrated care systems, but actually when you read, and there's a very good article in the King's Fund this morning or in the last couple of days about it, when you read it, it actually separates out the NHS organisation from the whole system, from the other parts of the system. So in essence, what you have is an integrated care entity at that regional level. Then you've got place and neighbourhood elements underneath that. But alongside that, you've got the NHS provider still sat there. And then you've got the local authority, the voluntary sector, Health Watch, and all the other partners. So it begs the question again around what they're saying in the guidance, that the NHS should have due regard for the one system plan, but it's not mandatory. It's not, so again, it's a bit like power. Where does the power sit? So for me, I think there is expected in the next year some statutory, obviously, guidance and legislation to embed the new ICSs. But I think there's a real need to bring a coalition of the national organisations together to influence the NHS and to present a compelling case in order to influence what that statutory guidance will look like, and actually ensure that that citizen voice and that lived experience is core and part of that governance structure. And it's not something that's just left, to a whim, and it's not something that's left outside the system independently. It still needs that independent scrutiny from Health Watch and CQC and whatever. But actually, we did it last year with about 7 other organisations nationally who were all working around the dementia agenda. And the new chief exec of the Alzheimer's Society, Kate Lee, and others, including me, came together and said, actually, what we need is a Dementia One Voice focus. We've all got our different issues, we've all got our different focus areas, but actually we need to come together. And if we really want to push and ensure that the national guidance, in particular around COVID, we're listening to carers and people living with dementia, then we needed to stand together on it. And I think the time is right now for the coalition of other organisations nationally to come together with Ageing Better, because there is evidence and we know it works. And again, going back to Emil's point, if we don't do it now, when?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Anna. And I know that we're going to have a conversation after this about how maybe to link people together to have, more further conversation around this, and how to bring those voices. There are enough voices in the room across this festival, for example, that have those sort of positions of, I suppose, influence. Thank you so much. Val, I wanted to come over to you next, because I know that you were itching to say something earlier.
I'm conscious we haven't got a lot of time now, Vicky, but just to briefly introduce myself. I was part of the Older People's Alliance for the Bright Life project, and as such, we were responsible for commissioning, we commissioned over 50, something like 58 projects, and spent over £2 million, and that was all made up of a panels made up of older people. What my question is about is, what advice would you give to an organisation that is predominantly a provider who wants to build in co-production into everything it does? Like lots of charities, obviously, they're chasing the money a lot of times. They often have very little notice when some funding becomes available for something. Have people got advice about a provider organisation, how they can put in place co-production?
Great question, Val. Thank you. Anyone want to come in on that? Emil's already got his hand up, but
I would actually, interestingly, Val, I was going to ask a similar question, because also for us, it's really interesting. It would be interesting to hear as commissioners what organizations are going through in order to have that evidence and have that co-production model in place and have the necessary information and evidence to show the journey, the legacy and the prep for applications. And often, as you say, there is 4 weeks to apply for something, and how do you do that? And it's really interesting. It would be interesting to hear from some of the community organizations. We always say that it's great to see some sort of organizations having co-production or citizen advisory groups, whereby these groups kind of work with the organization at all times to discuss their priorities, demands, and what the direction of travel. So if a bid comes out, this has probably been already discussed or is part of the co-production or part of the advisory group existence. And we often look in applications whether there is that kind of evidence, rather than a sentence which we often hear, citizens told us. But we always ask for, if you say what, say how. And for us, you know, procurement is, as my colleague in the council says, procurement is recruitment times million. So we have to know all the different aspects of, yes, okay, that's fine, but how, what, how, when, and it's difficult because we want to see that, but how do the organizations do it, and what process do they follow? I think you will answer both of our questions, Val's and mine. And
great, and we're coming up with a lot more questions, of course, which is inevitable of these types of conversations, but thank you very much for that, Emil. And Lisa, you wanted to come in on that. I noticed your hand went up, and thanks for your comments in the chat as well.
Yeah, I'm sort of mirroring really what Emil said. If you're chasing grant funding, you're doing it back to front. I see it as we're working with the community to see what the need is. We're designing and scoping projects, and then we're finding the grants that match those projects. So it's, you know, work with the community, find what they actually want you to deliver, because our service at Grow has changed so much over the 10 years. We're nothing like the organisation we started as, because we respond to how the community wants us to adapt and change. We design our projects, and then we try and find the funding to match it, and then the work's already done. I don't chase. I get sort of emails in my inbox all the time, you know, this new bid. If it's not on my annual plan to apply for, I'm not applying for it. That's why I've got 80% plus success rate with grants. Yeah. Because I know at the start of the year what I'm going after, and I'm only going after what absolutely fits the priorities of the community, not the priorities of that particular funder.
Fantastic. You're not trying to create an application to fit the criteria. You're doing it, turning it completely around. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Lisa. Chris, I know we're at past, but I think, you know, we can carry the conversation on for a little bit if people are still engaged and able to stay. So please do.
Yeah, a similar point really, and I'm a colleague of Val's in Bright Life, but I think it shouldn't be looking at it as co-production for winning a bid. You could be running the same activity and service for years, but the co-production should be running as a way of thinking all the time, to modify, to change, to listen. And then I think it becomes evident to commissioners, those people who are culturally tuned into that and can speak easily and readily, or allow their participants to speak easily and readily about what a need is, or what an idea is, or what will work and what's different. So I think the challenge then is, where organisations who are not attuned to that, is how you develop the thinking within teams to see that as just part of the day job, that you talk to your participants, you listen, you try and gather that, so you've got the intelligence, even if it's not to fund the service, but to influence the design of another service. You know, I think it's beyond just a funding technique, if that makes any sense.
Sorry, I've just muted myself rather than unmuted myself. I was just saying thank you, that's really valid. It makes perfect sense. And Maria's also put some information in the chat, but lots of people are putting stuff in there. It's, you know, there's so much to say, isn't there? That hopefully, because the National Lottery Community Fund is now so invested in the co-production model, that will influence other mainstream funders to do the same, because of course they do have quite a lot of influence, don't they? And I love that Anna's brought in Brené Brown. I always love a good Brené Brown quote. You know, stories are data with a heart, to quote Brené Brown, which is absolutely true, and that's what we're about, isn't it? It's about the heart of the communities, and including that in everything that we do. I'm sure we could carry this conversation on for at least another half an hour, but we better stop there because we have got a schedule. But thank you so much for everybody's thoughts, opinions, ideas, and questions. And I too, I think, need to watch this again and really take it in, and just see how we can, take that conversation forward and link people together from across the festival, because it's such an important conversation to be had. So thanks so much for everybody, and enjoy the rest of the festival for those of you that are going on to other sessions across the week.